Okay, so we're up and running now. So let me welcome everybody who's watching and all of the participants here to the Society for Systematic Philosophy's book panel on Richard Dien Winfield's book, Modernity, Religion, and the War on Terror. So I just want to say a few words about Richard and about his book. I'll also share my screen, so those of you who aren't familiar with the book who are watching can get a sense of the book. So Richard Dien Winfield is distinguished research professor of philosophy at the University of Georgia. He's a distinguished and leading scholar of Hegel. He's published too many books to mention and too many articles to mention on more or less all subjects, all areas of philosophy. This is relatively unique, I think, in the 21st century to have a philosopher writing on basically almost every area. He's the past president of the Hegel Society of America. This book, Modernity, Religion, and War on Terror, I think was originally published with Ashgate, right, in 2007, though now it's available with Routledge. I don't know if Ashgate was acquired by them, but I'll show this book in just a minute. Let me go ahead and share my screen and we can take a look at the text together. So I'm just going to read here's the text, Modernity, Religion, and the War on Terror. And I'll read the description here. The war on terror cannot be truly understood without investigating the legitimacy of modernity, the challenge that religion presents to modernization, the inescapable conflicts attending the emergence and expansion of modernity, and the post-colonial predicament from which Islamist reaction arises. Richard Dien Winfield illuminates the war on terror in light of these issues, presenting an anti-foundationalist justification of the rationality and freedom of modernity, while assessing how religion can stand in opposition to modernity and why Islam has been a privileged vehicle of anti-modern religious revolt. Winfield shows that the privatization that religion must undergo to be compatible with modern freedom involves no capitulation to relativism, but rather is a theological imperative on which the truth of religion depends. Exposing the limits of any purely secular modernization of Islam, Winfield shows how Islam can draw upon its core tradition to repudiate the oppression of Islamist reaction and become at home in the modern world. Richard, I was hoping that you could say something about the cover before we jump in. This was sculpture, right? We can't hear you, Richard. Can you unmute yourself?
Right. It's a sculpture by Meredith Bergman.
Okay.
Who has recently been doing a fair amount of public sculpture. Recently unveiled some statues of suffragettes in Central Park and has some well-received public sculptures in places like the Boston Common and elsewhere. I knew her because my wife had taken a sculpture class at the Art Students League in New York City many years ago, and Meredith was a student as well. But I think it's a very striking work. I think it deserves to be put in public spaces. And there is an example. We have a small version, and there's a larger version that is in the cathedral up beyond Columbia University in Manhattan.
I see. Okay. Thanks so much for giving us some insight into the cover there. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first commentator, and this is Dr. Sebastian Stein. He's the postdoc at the Universität Heidelberg. That's your current position, yeah? Yeah. And the project that Sebastian is working on is Metaphysik und Methode, ein Beitrag zur gegenwärtigen Metaphilosophie. Seems like a very interesting project. You can go on the website and read what he's doing there. He did his Magister in Heidelberg, and he did his PhD at Oxford in 2012 on Hegel's philosophy of right, I believe. So I'll, without further ado, Sebastian, you can go ahead. See if you can keep your comments to 30 to 45 minutes, and then Richard, you can have 15 to 30 minutes to respond and to comment on Sebastian's comments. just depending on the time that we have. And then we'll take about a 5-minute break or so, and then Emre can present. And if this evolves into a conversation of sorts, more informal conversation, that's fine too. So thanks, Sebastian, for being here, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I have about 5 or 6 different points. Should I stop after every point, or just read them down?
So, Richard, what would you prefer?
I suspect it might be better to wait until the very end
Okay.
of your presentation.
All right.
Okay.
There probably are connections between these points, and it might be worthwhile to.
Okay. All right.
Unless you think the other alternative is better. You know what's there.
Yeah. Yeah, they're not necessarily as interlinked as one might assume, but well, we'll see. If I can stop anytime if one prefers to talk about a specific comment. Okay, I'll start. Okay, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for allowing me to be part of this event. I have immensely benefited from Professor Winfield's work for some years now, and I'm very grateful for all his efforts, his fearless and authentic voice, and his always instructive investigations into Hegel's work, as well as into what seems to me to be thought itself. To me, Professor Winfield is a perfect example of a non-dogmatic thinker that manages to avoid skepticism, who developed a unique voice and is willing to listen to the greats of the subject without becoming a slave to their errors. This specific book courageously tackled some of the greatest topics available for philosophical and historical contemplation with impressive precision and clarity, conceptual insight, and a masterful command of empirical facts. I will keep my remarks brief to avoid wasting anyone's time and patience, and stay away from topics on which I have nothing to add, mostly due to my lack of a well-substantiated narrative that differs from Professor Winfield's, especially on the nature and history of Islam. While I'm aware that this book represents mostly Professor Winfield's own thoughts on the topics discussed, Hegel often seems to peek through the curtains, and I will try to focus on where I think one might wonder if Professor Winfield's argument clashes with a Hegelian orthodoxy. I will try not to repeat any left or left versus right Hegelian straw man arguments for the sake of having anything to disagree about, although I found myself agreeing with Professor Winfield potentially against Hegel on more than one occasion. My first remark and or question is about the utopian vision behind Professor Winfield's narrative, the end game of history, so to speak. Pitting global modern or liberal against non-liberal forces and placing contemporary Islam mostly in the latter camp, one could envision a perfectly rational world where there's either no religion or where all religion takes place within the private spheres within modern liberal and democratic societies. Should this be Professor Winfield's utopia to be striven for, one might then wonder whether this parallels the debates between cosmopolitanism and particularism in international relations, or between a Kantian world order of potentially ironic perpetual peace and a maybe more cynical agonist Hegelian vision of world history. While Hegel is famously skeptical about international alliances between states, transnational empires, and flat out rejects the notions of a world parliament and a world government, the same could apply to how one thinks about the relationship of modern against non-modern forces. Could Hegel argue that mostly secular liberalism needs an enemy, or at least an opposition, to combat, to know what it itself is, to prove its strength and to stay challenged, to stay sharp and alive? Would a lack of opposing forces in world history make secular liberalism complacent, decadent, formalistic, and hollow it out until an internal enemy would destroy it from within? Not that modern liberalism needs more enemies than the ones it internally breeds. For example, egotistic individualism, distinctly non-Epicurean hedonism, ideological relativism, social alienation, overheated free market capitalism, sensualist materialism, rampant substance abuse and public health issues, the vain pursuit of virtually merit-free celebrity culture, and ever-growing economic inequality with its increasing extremely rich and poor groups of society. However, it seems that while Hegel thinks most of these are the inevitable price to pay for modern freedom, it might be that external challenges are required to remind liberal societies not only that it could be worse, but that they know who they are, what they stand, and in extreme cases would die for. So while Kantian intuitions might make us long for a world without spiritual and material slavery, war, extreme inequality, and without extremely differing, often conflict-seeking political spheres, Hegel might take this to be a dangerously wishful or representational thinking that falls short of acknowledging world spirit's need for internal particularity-driven and particularity-establishing dialectics between states and political ideologies. If so, would Hegel argue that all pre-modern or anti-modern forms of religious and political systems are here to stay and play a continuous liberalism-enabling role in world history? Yeah, that was my first point. Would you prefer to give an answer right away, or should I?
I could respond, and maybe it might be helpful, although I don't want to undercut what follows.
Oh, no, the next point is rather unrelated.
Yeah, let me say this. You know, you speak to some degree in the same breath of modernity and a liberal society, and you speak about all of the problems that I think are not incidental to the liberal project, but I think they represent ways in which one could say liberalism is not a full realization of modernity as a normative project.
Okay.
And I think it reflects something that I discuss in this work in pointing to different forms of foundationalism and the way in which the embrace of self-determination involves a repudiation of foundations insofar as self-determination, be it as it applies to reason, as it applies to conduct, as it applies to religion, as it applies to aesthetic value, revolves around something that is what it determines itself to be, that thereby cannot operate as a principle that has a given character and that then operates in the way principles do as determiners of everything else that will be derivative of them. The Enlightenment project, on the one hand, embraces freedom, but on the other hand, it treats freedom as a foundation. And that involves a deformation of freedom, in that freedom is treated as a principle, which means on the one hand, it has a given character, as found in the liberal social contract theory, where freedom figures as liberty, a natural autonomy that is given in a state of nature as a certain kind of capacity. And it operates as a determiner from out of which one constructs legitimate institutions. Now that ends up involving a real atrophying, or one might even say a impoverished view of freedom, which ends up revolving around the type of freedom that can be thought of prior to institutions such as the family, civil society, or the state. Namely, it revolves around personal choice and property. And that leads us to the kind of liberalism that revolves around a kind of minimal state that is concerned with upholding person and property and does not think concretely about the ethical communities that have legitimacy when they become institutions of freedom, which involves both rethinking, reconceptualizing, and in a way, reenacting what the family should be, what a just society would be, a properly civil society, what genuine self-government would be. So in that regard, I want to just put before us all, the idea that when we think of the project of modernity, it is not fulfilled by the liberal project or liberal democracy, so-called, which treats freedom as a principle and harks back to a kind of natural freedom, which indeed, look, we do have a faculty of choice by nature, without which we can't engage in conventional interactions in which we determine ourselves as bearers of rights of various sorts. So I just want to keep that in mind. And the other thing is with regard to whether, in speaking about modernity, I'm speaking about something that's utopia. Well, it is not something that is either nowhere or can never be. It is something that is connected to self-determination as something that can be realized in thought, can be realized in conduct, can be realized in artistry, and can also be realized in religion. It's not as if it requires the annulment of religion. And I think part of the book is to try to understand how religion, and in effect, all religions, including Islam, both have to a large degree and can make themselves compatible with the institutions of freedom that distinguish modernity. So I'll leave it at that right now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, then I get to my second point. Thank you very much. My second point is about the nature of modern anti-foundationalism, and also relates to some remarks Professor Winfield makes about the logic as a seemingly foundation-free science. To some readers, his remarks about pre-modern foundationalist politics and thought as something radically different from modernity might seem somewhat strict, given that also these embody the concept's rationality, albeit in implicit and self-contradictory form. So in one sense, they are different, in another, they are not. As soon as two humans living together in some form refrain from killing each other, there is right. As soon as there is a thought of unconditioned truth, there is philosophy. These are thought and reason and freedom, pretending not to be itself, not to know itself. So reason is always there, is always the foundation of itself, and thus of all reality and thought. The question is just to what degree of explicitness. So while there is a clear difference between modern and pre-modern politics and thought, it might be less severe than Professor Winfield suggests. This might appear to be a merely semantic point, but instead of calling Hegel's account of reason anti-foundationalist or foundation-free, seemingly implying an understanding or reflection-style negation to obtain between self-determination and the determinacy of foundations, or between the logic of the concept and the logics of being and essence, one could call it self-founding or self-grounding. In one sense, Hegel's metaphysics are without foundations compared to, for example, certain forms of essentialist reasoning, but in another sense, they are not. They're not without foundations, as they do not presuppose an essentialist known or unknowable ground, like God, substance, or nature. However, in another sense, essences, foundations, or grounds are still there. They are just sublated. One might thus argue that the concept's self-positing is its own ground, and to be one's own foundation or ground seems to differ from having no ground or being anti-foundation or being foundation-free, at least if ground and foundation are equated with objectivity or determinacy. On the other hand, if ground and foundation are equated with universality, as happens in the logic of essences, appearance, in appeals to God, substance, nature, and so forth, then concept metaphysics are not foundation-free, but describe the describe the self-positing foundation. The reflexive, ground-like relationship between self-positing universal and posited particular is abandoned in the logic of the concept, but it also ceased to exist with essence's actuality, where ground and appearance are one. Non or anti-foundationalist metaphysics could then be substance metaphysics just as much as it could refer to metaphysics of being, where there's no relationality between a presupposed universal and its particular, or vice versa. In concept metaphysics, reciprocity's universality as cause and particular effect has ceased to seem to differ from the effect that is also cause. The difference between universality and particularity is not presupposed anymore, but it is not gone. In the concept, the difference is individuality internal rather than external. The undetermined ground or foundation and cause is the determined particular, and thus self-founding and contentful. All determinacy and indeterminacy is part of the concept's self-positing or self-founding. In other words, if a foundation is something particular and universality is foundationlessness, or vice versa, then the concept's freedom is both. It is with and without foundation at the same time. Its self-founding is neither anti or pro-foundation. To call it anti-foundational or non-foundational or foundation-free might suggest, or could be taken to suggest, if one wants to do so, it does away with either determinacy or the universality of ground altogether, as if it were an abstract universal defined negatively as non-particular, or at least non-ground-like, omitting the logic of being in essence's actuality. While it is the case that Hegel describes all of the concept's determinations in terms of the universal's activity, the self-positing indeterminate universality is but an abstract moment that negates itself twice, but in so doing reveals that it itself is but an abstraction. There never has been such a thing as a pure, utterly independent, self-referential and non-determinate universal on its own, but this is itself a moment of the concept's truth that is particularity implying and thus concrete and self-founding individuality. In this sense, the concept has foundations, but these are itself in its form of particularity or are its own universality. Similarly, the thinker of Hegel's system might think that she starts with nothing but the thought of undetermined being, but as the dialectics this kickstarts prove, even the minimal determinacy of undetermined being has been the concept all along. Being is but its most abstract determination. One could call the concept, and thus the reason, the always implied, inescapable self-founding and self-grounding principle of all thought and thinking, of it in terms of being or essence, and thus in terms of presupposed or alien foundations, is to think it in one of its forms that is not explicitly what it is, but that it is nevertheless. Furthermore, given the system's circular form, any talk of assuming or starting with might just refer to a random individual's thinking along with Hegel's description of the concept's determinations, rather than to thought itself, or to a thinker who has comprehended the entire system and its circular nature, on which there is no beginning and no end, and in which the concept is in all determinations and where all foundations are shown to always already have been within the concept anyways. Like pre-modern socio-political orders are revealed to have been and to are modernity, albeit not entirely explicitly. Okay, yeah, that was the second point.
Well, let me respond to that. You know, there is a tendency that one often encounters, and I adopt this language at certain points in Modernity, Religion, and the War on Terror, of describing self-determination as something that involves self-grounding. Often one speaks about autonomy as if it were self-actualization. Well, both of these involve terms that, or as being in a sense self-cause, or that you think of freedom as an uncaused cause. In all these ways, one is adopting categories that themselves involve really a distinction between determiner and what is determined. And when one speaks about reflexivity, a complete reflexivity with regard to these terms, one is speaking about obviously undermining the distinction on which they rest, that is between the determiner and what it determines. And in terms of Hegel's logic, this gets undermined through the very workings of this framework of two-tier determination, through reciprocity to which you referred, where what determines and what is determined become indistinguishable, leaving one with self-determination. Now, admittedly, self-determination is something that cannot have an immediate givenness, which is another way of saying that it arises through a process of constitution where it is not yet at hand, but in the process of constituting itself. And if you think back on Hegel's logic, where we're thinking about self-determination per se without any qualification, it's something that clearly involves determinacy. It also involves determinacy that's determined. These, in a sense, are factors that enter into its constitution. And it can't be what it is without determinacy. And determinacy is determined, and determinacy that is determining. And of course, determining and determined themselves rest upon their being determinacy. So you could speak of it being enabling conditions without which self-determination or the concept cannot arise unless you have a preceding development. And indeed, because, as you're pointing out, these elements become incorporated within the self-determined character of self-determination, the development is one in which what is developing itself gets transformed. And in a sense, what is developing itself becomes both intelligible and becomes fully constituted only as a result of the development. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that it's appropriate to speak of that as circularity. We're not talking about an eternal return, for example. If we return to being, so to speak, in terms of the recapitulation of the absolute idea. We're dealing with being now understood and being the beginning of something, which turns out to be this self-thinking totality. Now, something similar applies to self-determination, not per se, but for example, self-determination of conduct. Clearly, there are all sorts of enabling conditions that enter into the reality of freedom as it pertains to rational agents. Not only must there be determinacy, there must be nature. There must be a nature in which it's possible to have animal life that is able to be rational and achieve a kind of autonomy of its own. It must be able to develop language. And language itself has to be, well, it can't fail to be something that is an enabling condition of thought without confining thought within any prison which dictates what thought can think or must hold to be true, which would be completely incoherent, but is not the case. Language having this generative grammar, having a lexicon that's completely flexible and so forth, is precisely the kind of medium that allows thought to be accessible and used by real agents in the world, and not have any absence of freedom. And the same thing with regard to artistry, right? Obviously, the creative process of the fine artist is not the absolute creativity of a divine creator creating ex nihilo. First of all, one is a being in nature, and one has all the enabling conditions that must be met in order to exercise one's artistry. One has to deal with some kind of material, even if it's language, as a poet and so forth. One has to have a certain kind of technique and the like. But these are not what one is doing. They become brought into the process. And one could say the same thing with regard to religion and representation of all the things that enter into it. So I think in accord with what you're saying, there are these determinations that are not themselves self-determination in whole, that enter in and are in a certain respect prerequisites, but their independent being is in a sense absorbed in the process of that which is self-determining. They're not eliminated, but they figure in a different way, where they leave undetermined, in other words, that aspect that is added by self-determination. And that indicates the kind of concreteness we're dealing with.
Okay, yeah. Because Romney, when Hegel says that within the concept, every moment is immediate and mediated at the same time. I thought maybe if one thinks of foundations as that being immediate, then in a sense they are still there. But it is also that they are mediated and mediating at the same time.
Well, I think a foundation has two aspects, which is different from how mediation and immediacy figure in the concept of self-determined determinacy. Namely, with a foundation, you have something that has a given character. The foundation is determinate, in other words. And look, all philosophers have aspired to operate autonomously, that is to say, without presuppositions, without being in the clutches of some dogmatic claim. But until Hegel, they all operate as if one achieves presuppositionlessness by finding the ultimate foundation, which is considered to be beyond all assumption, as Socrates will describe the good, because it is that from which everything else is derived. So that means the foundation has a quasi, let's say, presuppositionlessness or unchallenged immediacy by being the determiner of everything else. Now, with the concept, or what is self-determined, the immediacy and determining character go completely together. Because what is self-determined is immediate in that its process does not rest upon anything else. It is not determined by something other than itself. But at the same time, it is what it has determined itself to be. That whole process has a kind of immediacy, you could say, but one which does not fall into trap of foundationalism as being defined by a given character. And that's, for example, why to speak of freedom in terms of self-actualization is faulty, because the whole process of actuality, which fits within the domain of substance, is something where there is this given character, where you're talking in terms of actuality and possibility, or potentiality, if you will. Well,
Yeah.
that's not what we're dealing with freedom or self-determination.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. I'll move on to my third remark. My third remark is about the Enlightenment's relation to relativism or postmodernism. Here, I'm just wondering if Professor Winfield argues that by turning ontology into epistemology, Kant has opened the floodgates for a kind of contractualist relativism because he is unable to deduce and thus argue for a necessary objective content of morality and ethical life. One might argue that Kant and Fichte are clearly keen to avoid Hume's and Berkeley's subjectivisms by insisting that all subjectivity must always already relate to objectivity. And this objectivity is somewhat subjectivity independent at the same time as the two are related. While Kant and Fichte might fail to successfully deduce such objective content since they privilege subjectivity, ultimately reducing objectivity away, as some people argue happens with Fichte, or merely assuming it, as some people argue Kant does, assumes the nominal objectivity. Fichte would argue that, for example. The logical structure of the transcendental unity of consciousness and of Fichte's I and non-I dialectics seem to constitute some progress towards the unity that Hegel describes as concept and that avoids pre-critical objectivism and subjectivism. So would Professor Winfield argue that even if Kant and Fichte failed to successfully deduce the subject-object unity, they enabled it and thus constituted conceptual and philosophical progress? Or have they failed to establish objectivity because of their reflection-based prioritization of subjectivity? Equating objectivity with foundations, could one argue that Kant and Fichte went some steps towards placing foundations within reason's self-reference without reducing them away or placing them in a reason external entity like Berkeley's God? Yeah, that was the point. So I was just wondering how strict you are about the failure of Kant and Fichte to argue for some kind of subjectivity independent objectivity and trying to integrate the two compared to pre-critical philosophy.
Well, look, I think that there really are, from a logical point of view, and with regard to the whole question of knowing, there are these two fundamental options which fall within the entrapment of foundationalism. One can, on the one hand, make the ultimate principle something ontological, something that is. And that would be what Kant will brand as dogmatic metaphysics, where one privileges some determinacy and treats it as being, shall we say, objectively given, and being that on which all else stands. One can also, instead of treating a given determinacy of some sort as foundational, one can take a privileged determiner, where whatever it determines counts as legitimate. Now, that also can be characterized in terms of the transcendental turn, where, with very good reason, one points out that starting with a first principle and claiming it to be objective takes for granted one's knowledge both of what it is and that it has its foundational role. And that, we have to remove that dogmatic claim. And how do we do that? Well, we recognize we're in no position to make any claims about what is immediately. Instead, we need to first investigate knowing, which means epistemology becomes foundational. But in order to do that, the knowing in question has to be thought of as a knowing distinct from its object. And the reason for that is you can't investigate knowing without making claims about what is, unless you think of knowing as opposed to the object of knowing. Mm-hmm. In other words, unless you fall into what Hegel will call the opposition of consciousness. Mm-hmm. And that poses a problem that then will, in a sense, be this problem that all of those people entering the world on the basis of that turn recognize. You sort of have to you sort of have to somehow free yourself of that kind of divide, which is tantamount on the one hand to thinking of there being a thing in itself. Mm-hmm. that lies outside of knowing, which in that sense is not immediately accessible. And the other problem is that your investigation of knowing is automatically dogmatic when you take the knowing under consideration to be a knowing of an object distinct from the knowing in question. Because the investigator, such as Kant, is obviously engaged in foundational epistemology. They're engaged in the knowing of knowing. But the knowing that they are investigating is not a knowing of knowing. The knowing they're investigating is a knowing of an object distinct from itself. And that means the knowing that is employed by a transcendental investigator is made use of without being something that can be put under scrutiny in the transcendental investigation. There's that element of dogmatism. Now, of course, those who are opting within this framework have tried to deal with this, Fichte, Schelling, Husserl for that matter, and many others. But alas, there's no escape as long as you remain within this framework, within which you take knowing as foundational. And of course, you can construe knowing not only in terms of a noumenal subjectivity like Kant that's modeled on self-consciousness. You can take it as structure of language, something intersubjective. You can think of it as both ideal and ordinary, a practice in the world. You can think of a being in the world of subjectivity with cares and so forth and so on. You can think of it as power structures a la Foucault and all the rest. But what you're setting yourself up to vis-a-vis, let's say, the postmodern critique is you remain bound with a dogmatism revolving around a dogmatic assertion of what knowing is, and both that it has this foundational role, which of course leaves what is knowable determined by that structure, whatever it may be. And that's the problem of it having this taint of being subjective. It also means it's going to be an objectivity whose categorization is going to reflect its dependency upon the structure of knowing, which means the categories that determine what can be known are those that Hegel will describe primarily in the logic of essence, namely categories of that which is determined by something else. And so in Kant, think of the categories that are operative and given their schematization and applied through the principles. They're of a domain that is determinist, that involves substance, but a particular kind of substance, a substance in which, precisely because the structures of knowing determine any possible object, whatever it may be, the necessity in question is not a formal necessity, which in any way can recognize the specific character of something as having any necessary implications. No, it's a purely material, efficient causality. And ultimately that radically constricts what knowable objectivity can be. And it leaves out of the possibility, out of the sphere of knowing, subjectivity, morality, fine art, life, any such things that involve, shall we say, the concept in question. And I think if you look at these as the two ultimate options, dogmatic ontology, or I should say first philosophy is ontology, first philosophy is epistemology, then you open the door to the postmodern critique, which basically says, look, all our efforts in doing anything normative always rest on foundations, which are inherently arbitrary. So what are we left to do? Well, we can deconstruct all efforts at dealing with what's normative by exposing what are the presupposed foundations. And if we want to be consistent about it, we can embrace the will to power and make no bones about it not having any real universality and become a fascist. Right. And I think the way postmodernism basically gives the intellectual or ideological foundation for the fascist assertion of some particularity that shoves its rule over everyone else and makes no bones about it. Yeah. Which is, in other words, embracing foundationalism with a vengeance. Okay. And that's one of the enemies of modernity that obviously is raising its head once again in the United States, in Germany, and many other places in the world.
Yeah, something to be vigilant about. Thank you very much. Okay, my fourth point is very short. My fourth and short question regards the nature of the will. Hegel argues that the rational will can be described in terms of natural drives, for example, the drive to family, the drive to state membership, to citizenry, and so forth. However, such drives are neither artificial, as Hume might say, or mere convention, as Aristotle would say, in the manner that Professor Winfield calls them in the book, or at least calls the will in the book. They are, Hegel would argue, they are Geist as if it were not Geist. Since Geist is more concrete than nature, the drives and this drive to determine oneself freely is not artificial, but in some sense more true than nature. And since these drives embody necessary reason, they are not conventional and in the Aristotelian sense with its implied psychologist contingency. So I was just wondering whether this contradicts what you are saying about the structure of the will, or how you conceptualize the drives that Hegel says exist in us in a quasi kind of naturalist fashion. But of course, they are not natural in the sense of nature being in and for itself, but they are nature sublated in Geist. Yeah, because you call them artificial and conventional, and Hegel would argue against Hume and Aristotle that this is not what his concept of the will is about. Would you disagree with Hegel there, or would you say I've just misunderstood how you refer to those natural drives?
Yeah, I mean, I think when Hegel is speaking about the natural will, I think he's appropriately describing something that we do have by nature, in the sense of it's given to us by our species being, provided we are not impaired and we reach a certain level of physical and psychological development where we're in a position to exercise this capacity. It's a capacity. It's not an actuality, but it's a capacity. It's a faculty of choosing. Mm-hmm. And it, unlike self-determination, which is inherently actual and involves both universality, particularity, and individuality, as Hegel lays out in the introduction to the philosophy of right, this capacity is something that is formal, because the capacity of choice is involved in any choice one makes. Mm. And it's not something whose character is determined by its exercise. It is something that has to be antecedently given to be exercised. And that also means that the content of choice is in no way determined by the natural will. So the content of desires must be found somewhere else. Now, one place they can be found is in, let's say, the natural needs that we have as an animal organism. That is not a need for a family or a need for a civil society or a need for a state, but for other things that have to do with our survival. But on the other hand, by nature, we have imagination and everything else. And we can, of course, desire things that go beyond what we need to survive. But I think the key in self-determination, which is why it's so difficult to think of in regard to willing, is that you can't determine yourself if you're dealing with relations of the choosing will in relationship to things and objects. But when you enter into interrelationships or interactions with other agents, you can determine yourself in a way as a bearer of right, in which what you choose are ends, or what you desire are things that do not exist apart from that interaction itself. Mm-hmm. Okay. The most basic form of which is property relations, right, where you're willing to, in a sense, have and dispose over property, which is something you can't do independent from interacting with others who are doing the same thing. Likewise with political association. You can't desire to rule or to choose your representatives unless you are operating within a framework whose very reality consists in others exercising those same kinds of choices, which don't have their object of choice independently of that interaction, that practice itself. Now, in that respect, they are not given by nature. They arise, shall we say, in history. Broadly speaking, they're conventional, but that does not mean that there are not choices and desires that can be dictated by reason. And I think, in contrast to Kant, Hegel properly has no problem with desires being able to have objects that indeed are dictated by reason. And that means objects that are bound up with the practice of self-determination.
Okay, yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. That was very helpful. Okay, my fifth and again very short remark is about the relationship between modernity and its conditions. You touched upon this a bit before. Professor Winfield argues that certain conditions have to be met for modern social forms to arise. This seems to me a potentially empirical or historical point of view, or at least some Hegelian interpreters could call it that way, rather than the philosophically oriented perspective of, let's say, world spirit, where everything that happens is world spirit and is therefore internal to it, so that there are no external conditions to whatever happens wherever and whenever in history. Everything that happens are the dialectics of world spirit's free self-manifestation, and as such, neither contingent or necessary. World spirit is not necessary like Spinoza's substance, or contingent as kind of Hume's maybe particular episodes of experience. While from the historical perspective, it might be contingent that the first large-scale bureaucracy emerged in China, it is an expression of world spirit's freedom, and as such, it is itself free. Yeah, and I just wonder whether this way of framing it contradicts what you're saying, because you did talk about external conditions for thought or for modernity arise, for political forms and so forth. And I think given a certain differentiation between the rational modern form and then an external world or cultural or linguistic, and so like the conditions you talked about thought itself, could one accuse this notion of being dualistic in a certain sense, of opening a, let's say, logic of essence style differentiations between conditions and that which is being conditioned, whereas strictly speaking, from world spirit's own perspective, there is no such dualism. Yeah, I was just wondering, I'm mixing up the perspectives there.
I mean, I think that there are two kinds of conditions. And these conditions are not just a matter of being empirically determined. That they are present is an empirical matter. There's no necessity that the planet Earth be or remain a biosphere with enough consistent livability for there to emerge rational animals who have a chance to enact institutions of freedom. Right. That's contingent, but on the other hand, it's something one can think using reason as being something that is a kind of enabling prerequisite for the enactment of institutions of freedom. But of course, you have to know what are the institutions of freedom, which is a philosophical matter. Then you can think about what has to occur for them to come to be. And that also involves the way in which the structures of freedom are related to one another. Which I think comes out in thinking about the reality of freedom. I think Hegel sheds a lot of light on this, even though I don't agree with how he works out the details of the different spheres of ethical life. But I think it's clear from just a structural point of view. Individuals cannot interact as self-determining citizens if they are subject to oppression in society, in the household, if they're not able to exercise their moral autonomy, and if they're not able to exercise their rights as owners. Of course, you can't exercise any of your other freedoms if you're not recognized to be an owner, in particular of your own body, or if your moral accountability is completely ignored. So in a sense, one can think about what can be enacted politically, but you can't engage in any kind of free political enactment unless you are already operating within these other kinds of practices that have been freed of various elements of oppression. That tells us something from a systematic point of view of what process has to occur for the institutions of freedom to arise. And I think, as we all know, a lot of people make the ridiculous blunder of saying that Hegel is providing an a priori descriptive philosophy of history. Because really there is no philosopher worthy of the name who thinks that there can be an a priori theory of history that's descriptive, because we're dealing with a world of convention that also has natural preconditions that are themselves, none of it can be guaranteed. to be at hand or remain at hand. But what one can conceive is what normative institutions are, and on that basis, understand what has to occur for them to come to be. And in his philosophy of history, Hegel tells us, I think, and in a intelligible way, that, look, I'm making an empirical judgment. The institutions of freedom are beginning to be realized in the world as part of this new project of modern times. Therefore, on that empirical assumption, we can look back and interpret the record of history as a history of the coming to be of the institutions of freedom. Of course, that doesn't mean it has to have happened, or that it can't be obliterated by some big meteor that's on its way to us, or by all sorts of other things, such as global warming that gets out of hand. But that's what we can do. And so there's an empirical side in terms of figuring out where are we and where have we come from. But there's also the philosophical side, which when it comes to conventions can only be normative, And that's why in talking about modernity, from a philosophical point of view, you can only do that if it's something that is given a normative characterization. And I think some people do that, some do not. I'm doing it as normative as I think Hegel ultimately is, and tying it to the realization of the institutions of freedom.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's very interesting. I think it's also really relevant on the distinction between actuality and reality. Now to my final remark. My sixth and final remark is about the ontological necessity of religion, and thus relates to my first question about the end game of an utterly rational socio-political order, potentially global order. Given that Hegel discusses religion as one of the three inevitable forms of absolute spirit, not living religion and piety in some form would mean to suppress or neglect a necessary aspect of one's mental life, with all these self-contradictory, harmful consequences this might entail. For example, an individual that only relates to the absolute through art and philosophy will still feel a lack or void or emptiness within that results from not representing the absolute and not believing in it. One might learn to suppress or ignore this void, but it should always be there, and having it should have negative psychological and potentially physical consequences upon the person that suppresses it. Denying the value of faith or arguing for a religion-free society could then only work on psychological or sociological, but not on philosophical grounds. For example, one might adhere to a secularist sociological theory that negatively describes all religion as false consciousness used to manipulate or oppress citizens. Or one might have direct or indirect traumatic psychological experiences with religion associated with a certain negatively experienced person or community, or with dogmatism and intellectual oppression, and thus rebel against it by declaring it utterly irrational and to be substituted by the secular spirituality of art and philosophy. If rejecting such stigmatization of religion is indeed Hegel's view, then a religion-free society is not only undesirable because it is not realistic to expect people to receive their ethical inspiration and motivation from art and philosophy and their metaphysical bearing. This would be a potentially elitist notion that while art is for everyone, at least some kind of art, most people are empirically incapable of becoming ethical through philosophy, and thus religion is a necessary evil to keep most people from falling short of the requirements of modern life. Instead, Hegel might just argue that religion ought to be practiced by as many citizens as possible, including himself as a Lutheran and philosopher who thought philosophy was the best, but on its own an insufficient way of relating to the absolute, because representing the absolute in religion is a rational, spiritually inescapable and required thing to do that cannot be substituted by going to see a sports match, to the cinema, to a rave party, by consuming drugs, doing yoga, exercising alone or in a group, or doing voluntary work at home or abroad. So if religious practice is rationally desirable for its own sake and not just to keep a social order going, then practicing the most rational possible religion in a given society is something the state should promote and that will inevitably feedback loop back into the running of the state, as its citizens, bureaucrats, civil servants, farmers, and politicians, and so forth, will be religious also. To Hegel, this might entail that promoting the most rational religion that regions and cultures are willing to adopt by a variety of means could be undertaken in the name and or by world spirit or its agents. Hegel's remarks about the horrors of Christian proselytization, for example, in Germany's Saxony, as a seemingly necessary non-Christian but ultimately Christianity strengthening method, suggest as much. The promotion of Christianity would then be as much of an expression of modern reason as the promotion of other socio-political institutions. My question is whether Professor Winfield thinks this is Hegel's view, whether it challenges the rule of a notion of international law and the public-private distinction that Professor Winfield seems to describe as desirable, and according to which religion is a state or culture internal affair and should remain out of the state's institutions. Yeah, that's my final question. Thank you very much in advance for allowing me to take these, to make these remarks and ask these questions. I hope not to have wasted anyone's time by having missed the answers already stated in the text.
You know, many people talk about, for example, the situation in Germany and much of Europe, particularly Western Europe, as one in which religion appears to be dying out. In contrast to the situation in the United States, where, as early as Tocqueville observed, you know, this great multiplicity of religious sects seem to still be going strong. And well, indeed, that is the case, although there's a growing portion of Americans in the United States, you know, who do not identify themselves as affiliated with any religion. But I think Hegel is correct in regarding religion as one of those human practices concerned with searching for truth and searching for what is normative, along with fine art and philosophy. Now, philosophy can succeed in that search in a way that can achieve a kind of, let's say, justifiable certitude that cannot be matched by these other enterprises. But, you know, as he points out, they're all concerned ultimately with the same thing. And that search is internal to them. And I think that's one of the important reasons for understanding both how religion can live on in a way that is not at odds with the institutions of freedom, and for that matter, the enterprise of philosophy. Because religion, you know, is operating always with this framework where there's a sense that there is something transcendent, and what is transcendent is of such a character that we can only achieve what is of true value to humanity by relating to that transcendent absolute in one way or another. And that means that religion engage in this engagement has to deal with what is of ultimate normative value. And that involves ultimately coming to grips with what I think turns out to be the exclusive normativity of freedom. And that then has implications for what will be the adequate both characterization of the divine and characterization of the relation of humanity to the divine. And I think you can think through the general possibilities of religion along this kind of vector of, on the one hand, we're seeking for, you could say, our true essence in something that is in some respect transcendent. The more alien that transcendence is to us, the more problematic this whole relation is. On the other hand, the closer what is transcendent comes to us and represents both in its own character and what it demands of us, what is fundamental to humanity, namely our autonomy. The element of transcendence becomes undercut. And Christianity may be regarded as this ultimate attempt of religion to somehow save the transcendence, but eliminate the difference between the divine and the human by having, you know, an absolute that is also an actual human being. who somehow remains at one with the divine. Now, if you think of the institutions of freedom and regard that as being a fundamental human value, that means that there's a theological imperative for religion, of any religion, to try to think of the divine and what we need to do to relate properly to divine that will allow us to maintain our autonomy. And basically that means allowing for the room for secular freedom, for those institutions that make up the domain of right, property relations, moral autonomy, a family that is determined in terms of a special kind of self-determination, and likewise a free society and a free body politic. These cannot operate if they are subject to religious dogma that directly sets limits that go against the rights of individuals. And that means, to be compatible with what is of fundamental human significance, religion must accommodate in its own doctrines a relation to the divine that allows us to engage in these relations. So that if we're speaking about a religion that regards the divine as giving us commands in the form of laws, those laws have to be ultimately laws interpreted as laws of freedom. And that means, on the one hand, religion has to think of itself as privatized, not having direct control over public institutions, but being private in the sense of something one voluntarily embraces, and embraces things where the religious practice does not interfere with anyone's exercise of rights. And that means also that religions have to become, what's called ecumenical. They have to be tolerant of one another. Now, that does not involve a acceptance of the relativity of religious faith, because when religion is true to what is a fundamental human value and interprets its faith in a way that is compatible with that, it has to allow the embrace of a religion to be voluntary. And that means it has to allow for the coexistence of other faiths, and also recognize it has to have a faith that allows individuals to exercise their rights. Now, I think all religions have both a theological imperative to make that adjustment, and they all have the possibility of doing so.
Right.
Because faith has to be interpreted. And I think you find in all the major faiths representatives of an idea of interpretation which says, look, if we're going to regard faith as it's expressed, be it in revealed truths or any kind of customs or written documents and the like, if they're really going to be regarded as truly divine, they have to be true. Or as Socrates would say, in the Euthyphro, it's not that something is right because the divine says it's right. The divine says it because it's right. And that has to be the way in which we interpret the doctrine. We have to interpret it so that it conforms to what is right, because the divine could not be embracing anything else. That makes it possible for Islam, for example, which, like Judaism, represents the divine as completely divorced from nature, as pure spirit, an absolute will and mind, but one that operates as the Lord over humanity in this very, shall we say, unequal relationship, giving us law. Well, that can be problematic if we regard this law as one that robs us of the possibility of self-legislation. And so, as I cite, for example, Islamic, I cite the letter to Americans of Osama bin Laden, who's saying, these Americans have the audacity to think that they can give themselves law and have democracy. Well, the law, Sharia law, if it's to be true, it will have to be so interpreted as to allow for humanity to exercise rights, including the right to political self-determination. And that can be done. Islamists remain, involve that part of the Islamic world, which draw upon interpretations, which do not make that adjustment and don't want to make that adjustment. And what gives them, in a sense, their force is that there is this tradition in Islam, which on the one hand has this proselytizing character and this appeal to the exclusive legitimacy of divine law, And this then becomes a mission that is of international unlimited scope.
Mm.
And their aspirations then take on this radical form and challenging, in a sense, you could say, the institutions of freedom everywhere. And I think that is something that is rooted in adopting certain parts of that tradition and not making the kind of adjustments that are needed, and doing so in regard to what I think is the predicament in majority Muslim territories, which have undergone a post-colonial experience, which has implications for why the institutions of modernity, to the extent that they get introduced, are having such a rough time in being successful, because of all the liabilities that afflict post-colonial nations, which we can perhaps discuss later.
So I have one follow-up, just short follow-up, if that's okay, Gregory. Yeah. So if religion is rational, and it's rational to engage in religion even for the most enlightened possible philosopher, because every human being cannot but help represent the divine in some points, at least, maybe not most of the time. But and Hegel does say that Christianity, Protestantism, Lutheranism is the most rational religion. Would you deduce from that a command or a need for a state to promote Christianity or Protestantism, or to even export it? Or would you say a rational state leaves this utterly and completely to the individual citizens? Yeah.
Well, I think, a rational state in respecting moral autonomy and the other spheres of right has to tolerate religions that are tolerant, but not tolerate religions, the aspects and operations of religion that are intolerant with regard to rights and regard to moral autonomy. And that applies to all religions.
Right.
In other words, a just state has to ensure that religion privatizes itself and is ecumenical. And that requires adjustments on the part of religion. But the whole point really is that although public institutions have to ensure that that is the case, by having a strict line between, call it religion and state, they, on the other hand, are not doing something that involves an external imposition upon religion.
Right.
Because there is a theological imperative for religion itself to come to grips with how religious doctrine can make itself compatible with freedom. So I think there is not an inescapable conflict.
Okay. So if
either privileging one religion or eradicating religion.
Okay. Because if a religion is not so willing to internal reform, or if all the reforms seem to go back rather than forward in terms of modernity or freedom, you would say those states who do try and nudge religions to reform themselves towards modernity, they are overstepping a bound, or they are overstepping a line. They're interfering with religion in a way that they should not.
Yeah, I mean, remember the autonomy of conscience, of moral autonomy.
Yeah.
Gives us the freedom to have whatever kind of religious faith we want, whatever religious beliefs we want. Right. But that does not mean that we can be allowed to take actions based upon that faith that violate the rights of others.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in. Thank you so much, Sebastian, for your comments and critiques and questions and observations. They're very helpful for me. I hope they're helpful for others as well. And thank you, Richard, for your responses. Maybe we take a brief 5-minute break, if that's okay, and come back around 8:20, and then we'll be about 20 minutes behind, and then we'll have about an hour with Emre. Okay? Is that okay?
Great.
Okay.
Thank you, Sebastian.
Well, thank you very much. That was really good. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. Yeah.
Okay. You've already had your coffee this morning, Richard?
Yeah, I made my usual stovetop espresso
Okay, nice.
at around 5 a.m. and drank it down.
Sebastian, you've your screen is frozen. Okay, so we're all back, although Sebastian's screen is frozen. Hopefully we can get that fixed on his end there. Well, oh, okay, looks like there he is. He's back.
Oh, whoa. Okay, sorry. I think I got kicked out somehow. My computer just gave up, or Zoom or something.
Yeah. You're in proper form now.
Okay.
The digital model of you is presenting, I believe, more accurately than it was before.
The hologram.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a correspondence.
Are you introducing a 10-second lag so you can edit everything everybody says? Oh no.
So let me go ahead and introduce Emre. So Dr. Emre Ebeturk, he is an independent scholar living in Berlin. He wrote his dissertation on Hegel's idea of life and logic in nature. And I believe, Emre, you finished in August 2017. That's what I have here. Yeah,
that's right.
Okay, great. Yeah, and Emre and I know each other well. We were both students of Richard. Are both students of Richard, I should say. So yeah, we're happy to have you. Thanks for coming and giving your thoughts and comments. So please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, and I'm also happy to be here, and I'm honored to talk about a book that I have always considered as an outstanding, bold, and original contribution. I have too many things to say, but still, I mean, some of my questions are already addressed, thanks to Sebastian's questions. But I wanted to take the liberty to present something that is perhaps less philosophically rigorous. And I wanted to talk about the case of 21st century Turkey and do this in connection with modernity, religion, and terror. And I believe this case touches upon many issues discussed in the book and lay before us serious questions about the relation between modernity, democracy, and Islam. But it also makes one reflect on how contingencies play out and what all of those say about the role and limits of philosophy. And to me, this book is personally significant for two primary reasons. And the first is that it is the work that Richard and I discussed in my first face-to-face meeting with him. I remember having told him that I agreed with most of it, but I nevertheless found it a bit optimistic. And what I found particularly optimistic was the claim that Islam can go through a fundamental reform and coexist with modernity. But the book identifies the problems before this reformation and coexistence just excellently, and I find most of the solutions offered still pertinent and irreplaceable by others. So it is crucial to emphasize at the outset also that the problems Richard identifies and the solutions he offers are not just intrinsic to the Islamic faith or its practitioners. It also has much to do with the inequalities and injustice persisting in a post-colonial world, which stands arguably as firmly as before as an obstacle before any possible attempt at self-modernization. But the solutions are intrinsic and extrinsic to the solutions that are both intrinsic and extrinsic to the faith are, I think, both global, and a need for thoroughgoing reform and global realization of the institutions of freedom is still there. Because, you know, in the meantime, in these last 10 years, we've seen the rise of ISIS and other political Islamist movements, and the wealth gap is still expanding, and we see authoritarian movements are riding a wave of conservatism. So on the face of it, we might be further than closer to the modern emancipation of the Muslim world. The second reason why this book has personal significance to me is that I'm obviously from Turkey, and Richard talks about Turkey in this book and often brings in the founding of the Republic of Turkey as a special case worth considering. It is indeed, I think, a unique and remarkable case. And Richard's interpretation of this case is also, I find, distinctive. Some of his comments are rather, I'd say, atypical, especially considering when it is written and published. It is different from both the typical so-called Western view of the Orient and also different from post-structuralist or postmodern approaches to the region. I will soon give some striking examples from the book, but before that, I would like to go back to a few years before the publication of the book. Those were the years when Erdogan's Justice and Development Party, which I will refer to as AKP, it came to power. By the way, I also have a PowerPoint which I would like to share. It might make everything a little bit more interesting. Okay, we do this. Oops. Is it working? Okay.
Yep.
So those were the years when AKP came to power in 2002. And we all know the rest of the story, but I would like to still go over some parts of it. And I'm trying to do it pretty quickly so that I look forward to hearing Richard's afterthoughts after 10 years. So the headlines of the day suggest, maybe you can also remember, but the headlines of the day suggest that the West was cheering for the birth of this new Turkey when Erdogan's party came to power. This is mostly because the initiating emphasis was on removing the military's weight on the politics of Turkey. The US and the European Union considered this as of primary importance, and a move toward this direction also found a considerable audience among liberal public intellectuals of Turkey, media people, and also the big capital of Turkey. Indeed, Turkey has a long history of military interventions that kind of traumatized people on the left and right. And the associated traumas were kind of intense, and the shared feeling has developed in years as a firm opposition to all sorts of military intervention. Furthermore, many on the right and also business owners thought that such interventions cause instability and that hindered economic growth before all. And also many on the left have been skeptical of the army, partially because the Turkish army is a NATO army for which the goals of imperialists rank first, according to these people, and partially because the last coup d'etat, the coup of 1980, crushed the left in its heyday in Turkey. And also partially because some of them thought the army has a general ultra-nationalistic and anti-Kurdish tendency. And all this despite the widespread conviction in Turkey that the Turkish army is not really represented by a handful of pro-NATO and pro-capital high command, but also traditionally raises well-educated, secular, and modern Kemalist soldiers. So when the Stronghold newspaper of Kemalists printed this headline stating how uneasy the young officers of the army are feeling about the new AKP government, they were not able to guess how negatively the headline was going to be received. And it was negatively received. The dislike had to do with the last major military intervention in Turkey. It happened in 1997 and was called the postmodern coup, while it was only in the form of a memorandum issued by army commanders. But it was effective. They forced the prime minister to resign. They purged many Islamists from government offices. And within a year, they closed the Islamist party. That is the welfare party. And the military intervention that Richard mentions in the book. I would like to show you some passages from the book where Richard talks about how the practice of a religion can be congruent with political self-determination, that is self-government. above all, what self-government cannot tolerate is the entry of religious organizations into the political sphere to seek power. And this is not just about religion, it's about all kinds of pursuits of particular interest in the political sphere. And the reasoning is simple: self-government must be the end, not just the means for some other interest. Any particular interest would require justification, which will rest on something other than the content of what is to be justified. And this is the inescapable conundrum of all foundational thinking. And of course, in case of religion, the pursuit of a sectarian faith in the political sphere, especially if that faith has global ambitions, it can easily undermine democracy and subordinate the institutions of government to religious dictates. And this is why religious political parties cannot be tolerated and they should be banned. So accordingly, what comes next, Richard suggests that the Turkish military authorities were right to annul elections about to be captured by religious parties, but they should have not allowed such parties in the first place. So because the political sphere has a say over all the other domains of right, this is a must, not just for political self-determination, but also for civil, moral, and household rights. And later in the book, he expresses concerns about the future of secularism in Turkey, especially given the European Union's demands from Turkey to rein in the military. So, Richard was right. In fact, by that time, his concerns were about to be realized in full force. Welfare Party was closed, but in a few years, it was replaced by Erdogan's AKP, which was found more or less by the same people, including Recep Tayyip Erdogan. But how could that happen in the presence of a strong secular army? Well, in the then upcoming episode of Turkish history, Richard's sentences about military involvement would have been sufficient to have him prosecuted in Turkey. He could be accused of inciting military intervention. He would have been arrested and would be jailed pending trial. And he would have stayed in jail for years and years, looking forward to the day he would finally be put on trial. Indeed, that's what happened to the journalist that was responsible for the headline about the uneasy soldiers, Mustafa Balbay, together with so many others. He was arrested on charge of membership of a terrorist organization and conspiring to overthrow the democratically elected government. And the name of that terrorist organization was called Ergenekon. And the Ergenekon trials were the most important means through which AKP government started to take hold of the state of the Republic of Turkey. Allegedly, Ergenekon was the clandestine, secularist and ultra-nationalist organization in Turkey with ties to several military commanders, intelligence personnel, politicians, journalists, public intellectuals, university presidents, and certain mafia heads, and also to PKK, the Kurdish terrorist organization. And Ergenekon, as they suddenly found out, was responsible for every act of political violence after 1980 in Turkey. We watched every day on TV how the police found some hidden weapons, buried weapons registered to the army and buried in a different place all around Turkey. Well, the scenario, the acting, all of that was quite strange. All these people had in common was that they didn't like AKP, but it was utterly impossible for those names to come together and conspire against it. But they somehow managed to convince a considerable number of people, I have to say, except for those who have traditionally had a kind of strong hunch in Turkish politics, such as many Kemalists, a small group of secular socialists, and the Alevi community of Turkey. And when those with suspicion were to express their concerns, they were hastily labeled as putschist coup supporters, if not themselves detained as accomplices. Indeed, even among the academic circles, it became taboo to speak against the operation. After all, they argued those who were innocent were going to be acquitted by the judiciary. And the investigation started off in 2008, and by 2011, over 500 people were taken into custody, and about 300 people were charged with membership of the terrorist organization. This trial was then followed by a parallel trial called the Sledgehammer Trial, which then targeted specifically the military. Perhaps some of you would remember Çetin Doğan, a former army general. He was the chief suspect, and his son-in-law, a Harvard economy professor, Danny Roderick, he had a really hard time trying to convince other people that this is just a trial to defame the army and the opposition, with a case file full of absurdities using planted evidence and forged documents. So it must be the only time in his career, I think, he wasn't taken very seriously. But he was right. And what has later become evident was obvious to some of us from the very beginning. As of 2015, most of the people prosecuted and detained as part of these trials have actually been acquitted. And after so many years, forensic experts could finally conclude that the documents for the alleged plots against the government were fake, while the witnesses were either lying or contradicting one another. But why did this happen? Why was the truth finally revealed? Did AKP lose its control over jurisdiction, over judiciary by then? Well, not exactly. In fact, it was just the opposite. Let's go back to 2010, when Turkey went through a constitutional referendum. The referendum was mostly about constitutional changes that concerned the restructuring of the judiciary. It was presented as a reform package with all sorts of independent clauses. So it was a take it or leave it kind of a choice. And some of the changes offered actually seemed like reforms. And in this referendum, small Islamist parties and some of the liberals sided with AKP, while the party that gets around 8% worth of Kurdish votes boycotted the referendum, practically leading to a yes vote. So the changes were accepted with 58% of the vote. And international responses were all positive. European Union saw it as a step towards Turkey's full membership to European Union. And to give an example, the Enlargement Commissioner Stefan Füle said that these reforms are a step in the right direction towards fully complying with the European Union accession criteria. What the opposition saw was just the opposite, and unfortunately they were right, but the world was somehow not in a position to understand. And its control over the armed forces, AKP's control over the armed forces, thanks to this referendum, it seized full control of the judiciary. So by the time when the Ergenekon and Sledgehammer defendants were finally acquitted, and it was seen that the whole process was something like a false flag operation to contain the army and consolidate power, AKP must have still had control over the judiciary. So what happened? They had a bigger problem. AKP had a bigger problem, particularly beginning from 2012. The alliance of the two major constituents governing Turkey was falling apart and quickly developing into a full-scale void. And this alliance was between Erdogan's AKP and the Gülen movement. Fethullah Gülen is the infamous cleric, the alleged Imam of Peace and Interfaith Dialogue. He is actually so popular that you might have met his Turkish, Arab, and American followers at your campuses. During my PhD at the University of Georgia, they used to organize events with some of the professors without disclosing their organizational identity. Gülen movement was actually boosted by Turkish right after the 1980 coup, and even supported the postmodern coup, but Gülen himself fled Turkey to live in a huge ranch in Pennsylvania when there appeared again some military pressure on Islamists in Turkey in pre-AKP days. I would say Gülen movement has a bigger role in today's Turkey than does Erdogan's AKP. Indeed, if Erdogan's AKP had the government, Gülen movement took the control of the state with all its institutions. They had considerable presence in police, intelligence, judiciary, education, and military. Later, it turned out that they had access to the questions of central exams, for instance, required to go to college or to become a civil servant. And they were sharing these questions and answers with their followers, substantially impairing the meritocratic practices of the Turkish Republic. So they had also banks, TV channels, newspapers, and many supporters owning big businesses. Gülen also had schools everywhere in 5 continents. As Dani Rodrik says, his movement is one of the largest charter school operators in the United States, for instance. So AKP and Gülen movement represent 2 different approaches to political Islam. They are similar, but still they have certain differences. Gülen movement presents itself as apolitical, as if they have no political ambitions. Yet in Turkey, they basically captured the state. Now, in Islam, there is a somewhat controversial notion they call taqiyya, which is basically subterfuge. I mean, the kind of concealment or denial of religious belief as a precaution given the possibility or in face of persecution. So Gülen movement adopts taqiyya as one of its major tactics and advises followers to disguise their identities. So while Gülen is known by many as a pioneer of interfaith dialogue and religious tolerance, his sermons are actually full of hatred against Jews, Christians, Americans, and women. Oh, sorry. Oh. So while Erdogan publicly announced that he was the prosecutor of Ergenekon trials and sledgehammer trials, Gülen's factions in the state were doing the heavy lifting. During these operations, 2 newspapers played a crucial role, Zaman and Taraf. While Zaman has always been Gülen's movement daily paper, Taraf was there simply to spearhead Ergenekon and sledgehammer trials. It was run by some self-claimed liberal intelligentsia who had an enormous influence on the public perception of the trials at that time. As Dani Rodrik also states, it was through this newspaper and its writers that these trials could find resonance in the general public, both inside the country and also outside of it. Because of its role in these trials, Der Spiegel called Taraf as Turkey's most courageous newspaper, but it wasn't really about courage. So as soon as the partners contained their arch enemies, the strongholds of secularism in the state, they got into a power fight among themselves. It became publicly evident when the Gülen movement wanted to prosecute the head of Turkish intelligence, who was appointed by Erdogan's government in 2010. And in the following years, the Gülen movement tried everything it can to defeat Erdogan. They wiretapped AKP members, revealed mind-blowing scandals involving Erdogan and his family and several of his ministers. In return, they were increasingly being purged from state offices, and they were declared as a terrorist organization. Because AKP didn't have qualified people to replace those cadres of Gülen, they allied with ultranationalists and promoted them to these positions they occupied before AKP. So Gülen's final shot was an attempted coup d'etat in 2016. Maybe you can remember that. And many people in the West thought that was a staged attempt, but it sure wasn't a staged attempt. It was their last shot, and they actually lost. Erdogan emerged once again victorious. But this is how the defendants of the Ergenekon and sledgehammer trials were acquitted. This time, some of the prosecutors of those trials were linked to the Gülen movement, and they were charged with plotting against the Turkish army. So together with this feud, judiciary, army, police, intelligence, education, all had to be restructured. But in the end, they did not really become more democratic institutions as liberals or as the West hoped. Instead, they all turned into branches of the government. And from that point on, a comprehensive campaign towards an authoritarian regime built on the character of the leader gathered speed. And in another referendum in 2017, Turkey replaced the parliamentary system with the presidential system, making Erdogan the president with ever more powers. And in the meantime, Erdogan has become a hero for the Sunni Muslim world, a devoted Muslim figure that defies Western powers and often refers to the days of glory when the caliphate ruled over 5 continents. Perhaps more importantly, this process has changed the moral character of the citizenry of Turkey, leaving upcoming generations with a huge burden. Sorry. It is said that in 2013, the Turkey experts of the West were still not convinced of AKP's agenda. As an example, again, Roderick gives Stephen Cook, the Council on Foreign Relations Turkey expert. He said in 2012 that AKP has done everything it can to forge a more democratic, open country. And in 2014, the same person, Stephen Cook, was complaining that Erdogan was using the institutions of the state for retribution and political intimidation and manipulating judicial reform to his own political ends. And there are so many similar examples, although it is hard to say who among these experts and foreign states people were actually fooled by AKP's promises and its declarations of intent. And this is one of the questions before us. I mean, to what extent we as philosophers, for instance, can take intentions of certain political movements or figures seriously, or declarations of their intentions. But it is certain that about 40% of the public in Turkey never believed them. They simply knew the character of the tradition and its past deeds. And some of that traces back to several centuries ago. So when one reads the AKP party program or party platform, one can easily think that it's indeed a democratic party. But these are the people who frequently express the nature of their religious faith. And it is this kind of faith that Richard shows that needs a fundamental reform. And towards the end of the book, when comparing the Puritan Revolution and Protestant reforms to the global Islamist upheaval, Richard says, Islamists remain bound to the political sovereignty of Allah, rendering parliamentary government at best a dispensable strategic interlude. And I think this sums it up pretty well. This is what Orthodox Islam without a fundamental reformation is bound to be. And this is what Erdogan confessed so many times when he said he believed democracy is just a means and it can never be an end. So it's something like a train. When you arrive at your wish destination, then you just get out of the train. So what's the question to be derived from this case? One is perhaps whether we can be indifferent to the content of religion. Can we be indifferent to the sects within Islam, for instance, or should we be at equal distance to all of those sects? The problem with what I call the naive liberal approach to religion is that it takes the freedom of faith as a merely formal issue, but it's actually not. Faith is a content, and this content is normatively bound. And this means not every religion-based conviction can constitute a right. Now, the problem is to decide which ones constitute right and which ones do not. And on what basis shall one determine whether religious convictions are right or not? And what Richard shows in his book is that such normativity can only be demonstrated from within a non-foundationalist framework. The non-foundationalist framework gives a simple and consistent answer to the question: faith shall not undermine political self-determination. And the reason why political self-determination has privilege over the other domains of freedom consists in its being the only form of freedom that is justified on its own right. And of course, faith should not be conflicting with property right, household rights, and civil rights either. But as Richard lays out, the problematic aspects of Islamic faith and its particular interpretations that undermine property, household, civil and economic rights, these are also the problems. But when religious faith undermines political self-determination, then there is no guarantee that other rights will be secured. So the biggest problem is to do with whether the faith hinders or facilitates political self-determination. And Richard's book identifies the major reasons underlying the discord between the prevalent interpretation and practice of Islam with democracy and modernity. But this prevalent interpretation is represented, we can say, by Sunni Islam. And Sunni Muslims are Muslims that follow Sunnah. And Sunnah is the entirety of practices of the Prophet Muhammad that constitute guidance for Muslims to follow. In other words, these are stories told about Muhammad and also conveyed from generations to generations. These are the defining features of Sunni Islamic identity and practice. Just like Quranic verses, most of these practices and advice are too literal, giving meager space for reinterpretation. And more importantly, beginning from its very origins, this tradition construed religion and faith as bound up with ruling. So Sharia cannot just be the law that concerns the religious and moral conduct of a community. It must have a say on every human conduct. As Richard puts it, it combines religious and political authority and regards all governance as the rule of Allah. And that is why the religion and the state are not separable, and the caliphate seems to be the logical conclusion of Sunni faith. As Richard indicates, Islam does not necessarily privilege any clerical authority in defining or interpreting the faith. However, in practice, the history of Islam has shown counterexamples such as muftis issuing fatwas, which are in practice quite binding for the believers, which in most Sunni examples were institutionalized and incorporated in the state. Ottomans, for one, had a strict hierarchy of muftis, on top of which they had a Shaykhul Islam, who often had an enormous influence over the ruler and over the public. Also, Richard notes that the divisions within Islam arose over disputes about political leadership rather than religious doctrine, and this factor played a part in the absence of strict ecclesiastic authority in Islam. But I think it is also important to see that regardless of the origins of these disputes, today different approaches to Islam come with completely different bundles of social, cultural, and political doctrines. And it is hard to say that Sunnis and Shias are tolerant toward or recognizant of other sects and interpretations. And many subsects within each sect is even today still considered as heretical. But perhaps what is the worst is that some of these sects have a global ambition, and the global rule of Islam is to be achieved, according to these believers, through the conversion or extermination of all the kafirun, that is, all the infidels. Nevertheless, when we look at Turkey, the example of Turkey, although Alevis and non-religious citizens constitute a substantial share of the secular vote, there are also a significant number of Sunnis who do not practice their faith too literally or consider faith as a matter of who consider faith as a matter of individual conviction, and who show respect to other religious faiths or practices, and who also do recognize civil laws and courts. But how could this be achieved? There are different explanations. Perhaps the multi-ethnic character of the land allowed different cultures to interact, especially in big cities like Istanbul, and maybe mingle in a way that prepared them for peaceful coexistence. It is also clear that the Anatolian culture is significantly influenced by Alevi and Bektashi traditions, which are already secular cultures for centuries. Alevis make up around 15% of the population, and Alevi faith is almost totally emancipated faith that has near to no conflict with moral, household, civil, or political rights. Nonetheless, the secular institutions of the Republic of Turkey managed to raise generations after generations modern and secular citizens, and this was possible through the Kemalist project of modernization and the compulsory public and secular educational system. So many liberals in Turkey explain the recurring resurgence of Islamism to the failure of Kemalist project, the single party period, and its external imposition of modern norms without actually convincing people. And unlike Richard, they do not only criticize the contingent features that are imposed without really a good reason, they criticize the whole project. But when compared to many other Muslim majority, Sunni majority countries, it is perfectly plausible to think that without this project, people of Turkey could have been more sectarian and less free, less emancipated concerning their religious practices. And I think in this regard, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk has achieved an unprecedented success with the political, legal, and cultural revolutions he initiated in Turkey. But he did so not as a democratic leader. He did so as an autocrat who believed in democracy, trying to establish the conditions necessary for the workings of a government. And this raises another question, this time concerning the normativity of the struggle for self-government. And I think in this regard, it's also important to note that the Islamic movements and tariqas in Turkey have received biggest support from economically liberal right and from the immigrant Turks living in the West under, again, democratic governments. It might be true that external impositions alien to religious concerns are not sufficient to reform a religion, and that there must be, and there are internal motives for such reformation. And Richard provides an excellent account of such motives in relation to freedom as the truth of humanity. He also shows how this is possible in terms of the religious commands, questionability, and their necessary openness to interpretation. Admittedly, especially Quran can sometimes be extremely literal and almost impossible to interpret in different ways, in ways that concur with the norms of freedom. In such cases, of course, it is possible to even deny the authenticity of those commands and turn to what is inner. And this is basically what many Alevi communities did and are still doing. However, this is also one reason why they are hated by so many others. So to give an example, not in the distant past, but in 1993, 33 Alevis were burned alive in the city of Sivas while they were basically celebrating a cultural festival. So the elephant in the room is to figure out what to do with the majority that thinks that there is no need for such reformation at all. And the case of New Turkey, I think, shows that this is an urgent problem to deal with carefully. Thank you for your patience. I'm going to stop here, and I look forward to hearing Richard's afterthoughts again after 10 years. Yeah.
Richard,
Let me stop sharing my screen.
please, Richard.
Yeah. You know, I think when you think about what's happened in Turkey, in a way, it almost has counterparts when you think about what's happened in the Soviet Union and what resulted from its dismemberment and the Yeltsin's banning of the Communist Party and so forth. You know, religious faith can maintain itself among a population that does not act on that faith and is compelled not to act on that faith in various ways. You know, you can have secular leaders as they operated in the Soviet Union who basically did not really want religion to operate. And they, to some degree, took over religious institutions, purged, and you know, in many cases exterminated not only people of faith, but clerics and so forth, and pushed basically a form of atheism. And in Turkey, you know, Mustafa Kemal, the Ataturk, not only eliminated the caliphate in both respects of the Sultanate and the highest religious authority having any role to play in public life, but basically kept Islam from intruding in the public domain, preventing clerics from wearing any particular clothing that would indicate that they were clerics, having secular schooling, having a purely secular culture, and so forth. Of course, that secularism was tied to a particular nationality that involved various issues regarding the kind of multicultural, multi-ethnic character of Turkey, even that part of Turkey, or that part of the Ottoman Empire that became Turkey after all the other parts were dismembered, thanks to the aftermath of World War I, and you could say the colonial enterprises of Britain and France. But I think what one sees is that although individuals can, you could say, act in bad faith and not openly defy secular institutions, that faith can remain and be a faith whose uncompelled expression can pose a challenge to secular freedoms. So that you have this rule of the Bolsheviks, which operated for 70 years, and yet when it collapsed, you had a very strong resurgence of the Russian Orthodox Church, and in a way, its attempt to assert itself in civil life and so forth. And it had not been eliminated, and that aspect of faith had not been eliminated. It was there and has repercussions for, in some respect, the ability of a democratic regime to be fostered. And I think in Turkey also, one sees that among a certain part of the population, the secularization achieved by Mustafa Kemal was incomplete. And I think it reflects the limitations of a reform that operates from the level of politics. It's extremely hard for political reform to enter the interiors of faith and conviction. And also that applies to family life, of course, and the way in which families operate, the way in which marriages occur, the way in which religious restrictions can intrude in those relations, even if the political domain and its legal extensions have attempted to achieve at least a certain compliance, an external compliance with secular norms in terms of the household, social relations and political relations. But there is this abiding issue of religious faith in its own right. And one thing that has been exposed, I think, throughout many majority Muslim nations is that given all of the pressures of the post-colonial predicament, where we have nations that, unlike Turkey in a way, had modernization imposed upon them from without. Because Turkey, like Japan, is an example of a nation that to a large degree modernized itself without allowing imperialist, colonialist external forces overturning the pre-modern institutions and imposing a version of modernity that, given its external and unilateral imposition, was also prey to serve the imperial interests of the colonizers. And in that regard, when decolonization occurs, we have nations in which you have the continuation of pre-modern traditional norms that also have a religious dimension. You have a relatively impoverished modern infrastructure, and you have a nation which finds itself in a world where it has to contend with nations that modernize themselves, which have larger economies, larger scientific establishments, more powerful military, and therefore the modernized institutions in the post-colonial sphere are weak in dealing with these kind of inequalities. And what do you have in Muslim nations? Well, when the post-colonial regimes end up being unable to sustain or institute genuine democratic political institutions, secular opponents are basically subject to authoritarian repression. But you have the mosques. You have this whole religious infrastructure, which is there and remains perhaps the only organized social reality facing the authoritarian regime. And it's being a place where Islamists have their home, where secular opponents of the regime do not want to find themselves. But the Islamists have a home, have a base, and in that regard are going to be in a position to be an opposition that has more structure, more organization, more power than other oppositions. And I think the case in Turkey shows, on the one hand, the limitations of secular reform to confront anti-modern or intolerant religious traditions, and how they can operate when there hasn't been a kind of reformation from within. Hegel himself, of course, emphasizes the role, at least in Europe, of the Protestant Reformation as playing a key role in the project of modernity, where the Reformation that leads to Protestantism, of course, can have its counterparts in Reform Judaism, for example, in a kind of new Catholicism, perhaps, that becomes ecumenical and the like. And in a way, in forms of Islam that have not just submitted to to being deprived of political hegemony by foreign imperialism, but in a sense have welcomed that detachment of religion and state as something that is required by religion if it's going to be truthful. But obviously that is not something that is that has succeeded. I think the very existence of political Islam indicates that Reformation is anywhere near complete. And that's not simply a matter of political Islam that may engage in terrorism. It involves political Islam of the sort that Erdogan's party represents, that the Muslim Brotherhood represented in Egypt after the fall of the secular tyrant. And I think what Emre had to say, I think shows us how in Turkey the secular project of Ataturk was not completed, not simply because it didn't achieve complete political emancipation, but it did not really affect a religious reform from within. And in a way, it can't be affected by a political leader using political means. It requires something else. But I don't think that it's impossible. But of course, there's no guarantee that succeed. And I think I realize as that there are many who regard themselves as proponents of freedom, who would be wary of recognizing what I think is a fundamental aspect of democracy, which is that political parties cannot be allowed to define themselves in terms of anything particular. In other words, they must be open to all citizens, irrespective of their religious or ethnic or identities or their social positions. So that applies both to religious parties. It applies to parties that identify themselves as labor parties. in the strict sense of being parties representing a particular class. It represents parties that might define themselves in terms of race or ethnicity. And I think in every case, that represents a challenge, because what it means is that we have groups vying for political power. We're not going to be doing so in the name of the citizenry and its promotion of the rights of all, but involves a struggle for power by one group, which will rule in the name of that group over everyone else. And that means the annihilation of self-government. And that then obviously has implications for what's going on in Turkey today, the character of the political party that is ruling. And when we speak about the European Union being very wary of the military intervening in political affairs, one has to consider the situation. Obviously, for democracy to be fulfilled, the military must be under civilian rule. But you can have conditions where the military is a bulwark of secularism. And robbing the military of the ability to do that in a situation where you do not yet have the conditions for complete democratization can be something that is problematic. And I think the situation of Turkey involves those kinds of those complexities. Emre, if you'd want to maybe.
Yeah, maybe one question is that similar arguments could perhaps be given with respect to certain kind of autocratic governments and certain, it doesn't have to be military interventions, but it can also be some kind of factional or some kind of revolution, for instance. To what extent or in what sense can we evaluate such attempts? To what extent can those be justified? Again, we're coming to the same problem over and over again. So we are talking about a domain that is kind of that does not belong to the domain of political self-determination, but domain that precedes it. Or even when we have the political government, when it starts to decay, it becomes a corrupt government, then again we find ourselves in a condition we're not in that domain of self-determination anymore.
Yeah.
So what rules are going to apply in those cases?
I think this reflects an issue that Hegel discusses when he speaks about how you just can't impose a constitution on a community and have that be equivalent to the emancipation of that community. You can impose a constitution which above all is specifying the form of political organization and the norms of political conduct. But political freedom cannot operate unless you also have social freedom and household freedom and freedom of conscience, which means the success of a cultural transformation, which involves a religious reformation. If that does not occur, democratic elections are not going to, in a sense, be equivalent to political self-determination. Because in non-political spheres, there are going to be all these obstacles to citizens actually being free to determine themselves. And of course, when you allow religion to directly intrude upon politics with religiously defined political parties, then that's most obvious at the political level. So I think that is, it's crucial to recognize the way in which political self-determination cannot operate without social and household and cultural emancipation. And it's not, and that's another way of seeing why genuine self-government does not have to be constrained from without to uphold pre-political rights. Because you can't really have political self-government in a genuine sense if the body politic is not at the same time ensuring that we have a genuinely civil society in which equal opportunity is realized in social relations, and likewise with regard to the family, and likewise with regard to the freedom of conscience and what that means for religion and the operation of religion. All of these things go together, and all of the well, you could say all of the failures of the Arab Spring is another case in which these interconnections are on display.
Okay, thank you, Emre and Richard, for your thank you, Emre, for your commentary, and Richard for your responses. Richard, do you have any final words you'd like to say to send us off with before we close the panel on your book?
Well, again, I think one has to really reflect on the importance of the relation of religion to the institutions of freedom, and how one cannot ignore that issue, and how we have to recognize that religion has a place in the modern world, a place in which it can not be an obstacle to emancipation, but part of that emancipation. But that requires itself religious reformation. Religions have to make themselves compatible. And that compatibility, however, is something that is bound to the quest for religions to be true. There is this theological imperative that religious faith interpret itself so that it is not at odds with freedom. And that is something that is not external to the quests of religious legitimacy. So I think we have to take seriously that relationship.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for your participating. Sebastian, Emre, and Richard, thanks for attending and for your thoughtful commentary and for your time. And yeah, I learned a lot from the session. So
thank you very much for the opportunity, and yeah, it's really rewarding and fruitful exchange. It was very instructive. Thank you.
So maybe
I want to thank all of you for participating. And I must say the book in question has hardly been discussed. It's had a few reviews. I don't think the reviews have really grappled with the argument in any meaningful way. So I hope others who listen to this will take a look at the book themselves and see what's there.
Yeah.
But thank you for your ideas and your attention.
Let me say before we go, before we end, that tomorrow we have another session, another book panel. This time we'll be discussing my recent book on Hegel and the science of logic. So that's the same time, 7 p.m. And I think, Emre, you're moderating that session.
Yes, I am.
Okay, so maybe
right.
I'll see some of you there. But in any case, thanks a lot, and we'll see you around.